After more than a year of war in Sudan, fresh ceasefire talks arranged by the US and Saudi Arabia are expected to begin today. While Sudan's paramilitary leader has announced plans to attend, it is not clear whether the head of the Sudanese Armed Forces will participate too. The army is struggling to halt the advance of the paramilitary rapid support forces, who stand accused of indiscriminately killing men, women and children in ethnically motivated attacks. Some of the worst violence has been documented in Darfur, in particular Geneina, the capital of West Darfur. A deadly RSF attack there killed at least 15,000 people last autumn and forced survivors to flee to neighboring Chad. Some 600,000 Sudanese people are now living in refugee camps there. DW's Mariel Mueller traveled there to capture their stories.
Khalil is 9 years old. He had a childhood with no worries until last November. That's when Sudan's Rapid Support Forces came to his hometown, Geneina, and attacked. Khalil still can't speak about what happened that day.
They shot from all four sides like fire. There were many RSF fighters. I don't know which side the bullet came from. We only found him shot.
Khalil was shot in the leg and needed medical care quickly. The family fled to Chad, where doctors amputated his leg. Before this attack, the RSF and allied Arab militias took control of a nearby Sudanese army base. Then they went door to door in Khalil's hometown, systematically looking for members of African ethnic groups like the Masalit community. They raped girls, burned people alive, executed boys and men. They left bodies on the streets to rot. Khalil's father buried 28 people that day, including his nephew.
The men had shot him in the head and his wife in the stomach. I found them inside their house.
During this attack, he remembers RSF fighters using racial slurs.
They abused us. They said, "You are Nawab, Africans. We will kill all of you. You won't have any land. This land will be under our authority, and we will decide who will cultivate it. It's a genocide against us. They don't want any black people to remain."
The United Nations says the RSF and its allies killed an estimated 15,000 people in ethnically motivated massacres in Darfur. Human Rights Watch has also warned of a possible genocide against the Masalit in the region.
First they killed doctors, then they killed teachers. They killed religious leaders and most people with an education. They wanted to end the Masalit people.
Abdurrahman speaks as a community leader and from personal experience. The same men he prayed with in the mosque in the evening abducted 12 members of his family and executed them. His son, a doctor, was killed while working at the hospital. Abdurrahman's surviving family also sought safety in Chad, but suspicion remains. Abdurrahman says their Arab neighbors in Sudan helped the RSF in pointing out Masalit houses during their attack, and some of them now live in a nearby refugee camp. There are other witnesses who corroborate this claim, and some who deny it, like this Arab community leader.
Civilians were never killed. This is a lie. The Masalit are lying. Of those who came to Chad, nobody has hurt them.
The divide runs deep. To prevent conflict, residents tell us ethnic Arab and ethnic African refugees are staying in separate camps. In their camp, Khalil's parents are happy to watch their son grow up in safety. And it's filling them with hope for the future.
When my son grows up, I hope he'll have a business. I imagine many things for him, working at the mosque and having children too. I just want my son to be happy in this life.
Now, as before, Khalil is happiest when playing football with his friends. The scars of Darfur will remain, but they aren't stopping him from doing what he loves.
I want to turn now to Geneina Lewis. She's a human rights consultant specializing in Sudan. She's an advisor to the group Preventing and Ending Mass Atrocities. Welcome back to DW. Now, before we dive into the meeting in Switzerland today, I'd like to get your thoughts about the story of Khalil and his family we just heard.
Thank you for having me. I think what stands out to me about the story of Khalil and his family is that it is a story shared by so many people across Sudan today. And fundamentally, the people of Sudan have been abandoned by the global community. We're talking about a country of 49 million people, a country that before the succession of the South in 2011 was the largest country in all of Africa. We know that famine has now reached areas of Darfur. And what this means in practice is that 2 in every 10,000 people are dying of starvation in Zamzam IDP camp, in particular in Darfur. And just to flesh this out, that means that 100 people every day are dying of starvation and the compounded impacts of malnutrition. This was entirely preventable if the RSF and SAF had not continued to block humanitarian assistance from entering the country over the past 16 to 17 months of war. And fundamentally, action can be taken to prevent the untold suffering of Khalil and other members of his family across Sudan.
The talks starting today in Geneva are aimed to put an end to the fighting and the suffering of millions. But the Sudanese army will not be present. Will, with just one of the warring parties at the table, will anything come of this meeting, you think? Can anything come of this meeting?
It's really hard to see a path to peace when one of the 2 sides of this war will not even come to the table to have a conversation around peace. Every day that this war drags on is another day that the path to peace becomes even harder to find in Sudan. The talks that started today in Geneva are supposed to be discussing the humanitarian situation, humanitarian access, as well as reaching a ceasefire and a ceasefire monitoring mechanism. But of course, we can't talk about a ceasefire if the Sudanese Armed Forces are not even present today. So my understanding is that the talks have shifted to more of a consultation process. We have a lot of high-level engagement from the African Union, from the UN, from the US, as the hosts, alongside Saudi Arabia and others from the international community. But fundamentally, if SAF do not come to the negotiating table, it is very, very hard for us to see a way to peace. And what we need today in Sudan is a ceasefire. We needed a ceasefire yesterday. We needed a ceasefire 16 months ago. And until that happens, this tide of humanitarian suffering will continue.
Just help us understand why the Sudanese Armed Forces are staying away, because as you're putting it, they're risking standing in the way of ending the suffering of millions.
Right, and that's really a question we need to be posing to the highest levels of SAF, including General Burhan, who leads SAF and is now the de facto president of Sudan. Why they will not come to the negotiating table? Well, they've actually been fairly consistent in their rhetoric over the past several months that they have no intention of negotiating with the RSF, and that for them to come to the table, the RSF have to leave all civilian dwellings across the country, and we're particularly talking about Khartoum, where they continue to occupy a lot of civilian homes. But it creates a very difficult dynamic because the SAF are setting preconditions for the talks to even take place when fundamentally these are conversations that should be happening at the negotiating table. And I wonder whether there's an element here of SAF do not want to be seen to be legitimizing the position of the RSF by even coming to the talks, but they have to come to the table. And Sudanese Armed Forces leadership really needs to step up if they are as committed as they say to protecting the people of Sudan and to protecting the future of Sudan.
Yeah. Geneina, the war in Sudan has often been called a forgotten war. To what extent can this meeting be seen as a sign of that changing?
I think it's a positive step forwards, but we have to be realistic about what can be achieved within these talks today and in the coming days. Sudan has been forgotten. It's not only been forgotten by the international community, the fact that the UN Security Council has had, frankly, very little engagement on this war, but also the fact that, within the international media, very little attention is on the Sudan war, even though the population is greater than the population of Ukraine, and even though the scale of suffering is I would say, the worst in the world. And that has also been backed up by several UN agencies at this point. So although Geneva is a welcome step forwards, whilst the key parties are discussing things like the national humanitarian situation, we must also remember that there is a humanitarian response in Sudan, and it is led by local Sudanese youth who oftentimes have stayed within their communities to provide frontline humanitarian assistance through mutual aid and through the emergency response room. So whilst the national picture is very, very important, international donors can be doing much, much more today to be supporting the humanitarian response in Sudan, and the international media also has a role here.
Human rights consultant Geneina Lewis, thank you so much for shedding light on this very, very important situation and that meeting in Geneva and what it could possibly achieve.